And so with us today, speaking of advocacy, we have Radio Iowa's very own Kay Henderson, who has seen a ton of advocacy over her 30 years at Radio Iowa and is now considered by the national media, of course, as the Dean of the Iowa Press Corps. So Kay, welcome, and you want to share a little bit about your background with our audience here?
Well, if you were listening to WOI radio in 1985, 86, and 87, when I was a student, I was doing live play-by-play of the Iowa legislature. This was before the internet. So you could turn on your radio and listen to the debate that was going on. And coincidentally, the very first time I was ever on the air, Brad, I was on the air for 7 consecutive hours because I was providing play-by-play coverage, if you will, of the Iowa Senate debating a bill to legalize the Iowa lottery.
Oh man, 7 hours.
Exactly.
I know my voice is shot after 40 minutes. I don't even know how you could do 7 hours.
Well, you know, it was one of those things where, you know, that was Senator Edgar Holden, a Republican from Davenport.
Well, how times have changed. So you're a pro, and obviously we've got the legislature coming into session, and they're kind of gearing up for a session in January. And I wonder if you could share just some overview of what you expect to happen here in 2022 in terms of some of the bills that they're going to be taking up and some of the hot button issues that we expect to see in the Iowa legislature this coming year.
Well, anyone who's been paying attention knows that sort of the marquee issue for Republicans coming up in 2022 will be taxes. They passed a really significant tax cut package in the 2021 legislative session. They're phasing out the inheritance tax. They're doing some other things. Notably, they are raising a levy that heretofore has financed the state's mental health system for adults and children. And the state has promised through that legislation to take over, I guess, ownership, if you will, but in other words, financing of the mental health system. So coming up in 2022, what we're hearing from legislators, just heard a forum featuring the senator from Council Bluffs, Senator Dawson, who's the chief of the Senate Ways and Means Tax Writing Committee. He's talking about a 5-year tax cutting plan. And he is talking about cutting personal income taxes and also perhaps, probably, maybe, if it works out, cutting the corporate income tax rate. The caveat there is that they would review all these tax credits. There's a very long list of tax credits in Iowa. At the top of the list is a research and development tax credit. If, in his words, he's able to reform those, dial back some of them, maybe eliminate some of them, then he would be willing, on behalf of Senate Republicans, to cut the corporate income tax rate. If that doesn't happen, they're just going to focus on personal income tax cuts. On the House side, of course, if you've been following the debate up there, you knew that the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans took some time last year sort of coming to an agreement on tax cuts. So the House side seems to be focusing on income tax cuts on the personal level and maybe some property tax relief.
Wow, so taxes, and then you're saying that they're going to focus on taxes.
Right, exactly.
I see. Well, so if anyone has any questions for Kay, by the way, put those in chat, and then Annie will bring those questions over to us, and we'll be able to answer those. And so I know one of the questions I have for you as an organization is, do you expect that we'll be seeing some of these lobby days? And is it going to look a lot more normal in your opinion this coming year than it has in the previous last couple of years due to the coronavirus?
I would expect it to be so. I would expect some of the big lobbying days, for instance, the Iowa Farm Bureau, I would expect that Farm Bureau members will arrive en masse at some point this legislative session.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. So over the years, you have seen some amazing grassroots efforts. And so in our mind, you know, some of the grassroots advocacy is when you see a group of people come together and they talk to their legislators and they really help push an agenda forward and get it to the finish line. And so I'm curious, over the years, what are some of the best examples of grassroots advocacy that you've seen in the Capitol?
Well, you mentioned grass. So there has been in the past decade a movement to change Iowa laws regarding cannabis, medical marijuana. And I'm reviewing this record because there's going to be a debate about that in the coming legislative session. So as I was looking back, in 2012, Representative Clell Bodler referred to the idea of making any change to legalize any form of marijuana for medical use. He referred to that as an asinine idea.
He was a cop, right, or a sheriff?
He's a former state trooper.
Okay.
So fast forward, if you will, to 2014, he became a proponent of the bill that was signed into law in 2014, which legalized possession of cannabis oil. And the reason that happened was because a group of mothers who had children who could benefit from using cannabis oil because their children suffered from chronic seizures went to the legislature day after day after day, and their children were with them and introduced themselves, made it an issue that legislators could put a face and a name with. But that wasn't as much as that group wanted. And so it expanded to other people who suffered from other chronic health conditions, cancer, MS. They sort of joined this group and kept lobbying. And so it wasn't until 2017 that the legislature legalized these grow, produce, and dispense operations with state licensing for medical marijuana.
Well,
so that's 2012 to 2017.
It's a 5-year effort.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I think people were calling them the cannabis moms, actually, and when they started coming in, is it safe to say that they single-handedly put this agenda item in front of the legislature? Because this would not have happened without those moms bringing their children who were suffering from seizures and showing legislators how kids could actually benefit from cannabis. This would not have happened if it were not for these moms. Is that safe to say?
Well, the case in point would be the previously mentioned Representative Clell Bodler, absolutely opposed to the concept. And after meeting these folks, he changed his mind. So that's a specific case in point. But I think the other thing about this is we always, look back on efforts to change the law as, sort of they asked and they did it. Well, it doesn't happen like that. It takes a progression sometimes. Things, have to be nibbled at before significant change can happen. And this is an issue that the legislature is going to tackle next year. And if I would go back to the last century, there were a couple of other issues or votes that sort of stick out to me. Iowa was one of the last states to legalize interstate banking. Oddly enough, this happened in the 1980s, and it was because independent hometown bankers, independent bankers in Main Street, Iowa, were very fierce advocates against changing the law. So that's why it took so long in Iowa to change the law, number one. And number two, I think back in 1994, Iowa Governor Terry Branstad made restoration of the death penalty a campaign issue because there was a high-profile death. Anna Marie Emery, a girl from Grinnell, had been kidnapped and murdered. And so that became a huge issue in that campaign. 1995, the Iowa House narrowly passed a law that would legalize capital punishment again in Iowa. It got to the Senate and it failed. And one of the reasons it failed, according to my reporting and the reporting of others, was that the faith community lobbied heavily against it. And if you took a look at the the register, because a lot of the times legislators will say, I'm a member of X church. It very closely hewed to the idea that, you know, the Methodist Church, the Catholic Church, these organizations lobbied heavily against it. And it was really interesting how effective that lobby was against the death penalty back then.
You know, it's funny you mention that, because the a lot of what you're saying is advocacy just doesn't happen overnight, right? And so do you remember the dove hunting issue and how?
Well, that did kind of happen.
Well, the legalizing of it did, but remember how long it took to get to that point, because for years, you know, dove hunting was going to become legal under Governor Vilsack, and but it was the advocates who were, I guess, in favor of doves, and they were out there day in and day out, just really protecting doves and making sure that the legalization of that does not happen. And I remember that issue going on for years. And so I think the point that you're making about advocacy not happening overnight, certainly with the Iowa Care Act. So one of the things that we worked on for years was the Care Act. Now, this was a bill to designate caregivers and basically give caregivers the protections that they need to go home and treat their loved ones. So when hospitals discharge someone, they need to tell people now, this is how you clean a wound. This is how you help a person get out of bed. They need to help caregivers with those steps. This was not law prior to AARP really pushing this legislation along with a bunch of other great organizations. And so, but it seems so common sense. And that's the point that you're making, right? Is that these bills, even bills that are bipartisan, that seem like common sense, just don't happen overnight. And so when we're talking about advocacy, even at the local level, one big word that I like to use is patience. You got to have patience and you got to be persistent. And so when it comes to getting your project to the finish line, it may take months, but you know, expect it to take years. And that's okay, because as long as you keep working at it, it'll get done. Now, I'm curious, so you've seen some great examples of local advocacy and grassroots. Are there any examples that come to mind that you care to share that are maybe some not so great examples of advocacy at work?
Well, oftentimes I think that people disregard the idea that something that happens in your community is less important than something that happens at the State House. And so I think the interpersonal contacts that people have back in the districts where these legislators live are far more important. And frankly, oftentimes things that I don't know or hear about until it comes up on the floor or in committee. So I just think that we can't disregard that. You know, I would sort of backtrack and say, you know, there's one really interesting issue that's coming up right now, pipelines.
Oh, I saw there's a huge meeting the other night on pipelines.
Exactly. And I'm reminded of Governor Tom Vilsack vetoing a law that the legislature passed on eminent domain.
Right.
And that was a grassroots effort on the part of people who really were opposed to some projects which were perhaps subject to eminent domain. They got together and it was a coalition from all over the state. And that was the one veto that I've ever covered that's been overridden in my 37 years of covering.
Is that right? The one veto. Wow. I saw there was a meeting, I think it was last night, in which had
Cedar Rapids.
Yeah, which had hundreds of people come out to meet about that pipeline. And so obviously, and it's a really important point that you make about talking to their legislators back home about certain issues. One of the things that we're focused on this coming session is elder abuse. Believe it or not, and people are shocked to learn this, but elder abuse currently is not a crime in the state of Iowa. And so what that means is local prosecutors have trouble prosecuting elder abuse claims because it is not designated as a state crime, unlike some states where it is designated as a crime. And so, but we've got AARP volunteers now reaching out to legislators before session and educating them on the issue. And so we're optimistic that the bill is going to be taken up this year. We're hoping to get it passed. But again, as you know, bills sometimes, even the ones that are common sense, like making elder abuse a crime, sometimes it takes a little longer.
And they've been debating it periodically over the past several years.
They have. And that's why I'm saying, and it's been a couple of years. And so now I think we're at that third year, Anthony, third year. So usually it takes about 4 years, right? That's the rule.
There is no rule.
There is no rule. Yeah, that's right. The bottle bill, right? Getting rid of the bottle bill.
Exactly.
Is another example of something that is.
And a note on that, it's far easier to kill something. In other words, make sure it doesn't pass than it is to get something passed in many instances.
Very good point. Very good point. So let's talk about bipartisanship just for a second, because it seems like every time you turn on the news, every issue is partisan, right? And you know, one of my favorite things about local advocacy is the nonpartisan nature of local advocacy. And I am curious your perspective. I have two questions for you. Number one is partisanship worse now than you have ever seen it? Number one. And number two is, are there any bipartisan issues that legislators on both sides of the aisle are working on to get to the finish line this coming session?
Well, let's answer number two first. The bottle bill is a bipartisan issue. You have people all over the map. You have some Republicans and some Democrats who are working together to try to change it. So you do find different kinds of coalitions arranging themselves in a bipartisan way on various issues. In regards to the first part, I think that we live in an era where social media amplifies the partisan nature of certain debates and certain high profile debates, for instance, abortion. But if you talk to some legislators, they will point out that the vast majority of bills that pass the Iowa legislature are passed overwhelmingly. You know, in the past legislative session, I've done some bizarre, interesting stories about some of those bills. For instance, they changed the rule for hairdressers so that they can go to the church and do the bride's and the wedding party's hair. That was forbidden. You had to get a special, license. That bill passed overwhelmingly. So you can get your xinjiang done at the church.
So I could have had someone come here to do my hair this morning.
Exactly. So I mean, but because of some of the attention that's paid on social media and in media to key issues, I think there's an impression among members of the public that everything is partisan when that's not the case.
Right. And I'll go back to our elder abuse bill. You know, we're really really excited about the fact that it does have bipartisan support. And so but you're right, on social media, you know, it doesn't get the attention that some of the more partisan issues get. And so it's really up to us to raise that issue and elevate it. And that's why you're going to see billboards. That's why you're seeing newspaper ads. That's why you're seeing radio, or you're listening to radio ads, on trying to, you know, raise this as an issue.
So you're converting those Tulsi Gabbard billboards to AARP billboards?
Yes. Well, not all of them. I think there are a couple left. So believe it or not, there are a couple of Tulsi Gabbard billboards left. You know, and one of the things, by the way, I just wanted to say something about radio, because you educated me on this when I was in the governor's office a long time ago. You had mentioned how to get a message out, really, the importance of radio. And you know, I think a lot of people say, all right, well, we're gonna do print, which is important, obviously. But I don't think people realize the reach that a Radio Iowa story gets. What is the reach of? You get a story on Radio Iowa.
So we have more than 70 radio station affiliates in the state. The northwestmost one is in Lamar's, the most southeast one is in Burlington. So how long does it take to drive from Lamar's to Burlington?
3 days.
Exactly. Number one. Number two, you know, these are stations that people in a community that provide a sense of community for a place, like a Sheldon or, you know, a Manchester. This is where you hear about the kid that scored the touchdown, or you can listen to the whole game.
Right.
Or this is the place where you find out what your kids are going to eat for, you know, breakfast maybe, or lunch at school. You also, you know, may find out, sadly, who died overnight in your community that was important to you. So they build a sense of community. And the people who work in those radio stations are the hardest working people in show business, if you will, because just think about it. They get up in the morning and they tell you the news at 6 and 7 o'clock in the morning. And then you go to the school board meeting that night and they're there covering the school board meeting.
Right.
So they're the hardest working people in journalism.
Well, and I think when it comes to some of the smaller communities in Iowa, and we're talking about some of these local advocacy projects, if you've got a really interesting affordable housing project, or you've got a brand new main street that you're renovating, some new streetscapes, it would be, I think, consider, you know, going to your local radio station and trying to get that covered, because the coverage and the amount of people that would hear it is a lot greater than you may think. And so we always lean on radio, and we're going to talk more about communications.
You know, and I can't for the life of me remember the study, but one of the studies that has been done is that messages have been placed in print and on the radio and on television, and they've been very distinct. And then they go back and survey people. And, you know, admittedly, radio is often a secondary activity. You're driving, you're listening to the radio. You're making breakfast, you're listening to the radio. But people, the perception of messages, we found that people thought they saw it on TV or thought they read it in the newspaper, but they actually heard the message on the radio.
Is that right?
Because it's a secondary activity.
Wow, that's really interesting. And you know, when it comes to radio, and now we're down a rabbit hole, but I do want to say, when it comes to radio advertising, or mail or TV, something that you need to think about, and we'll go through this when we talk more about building blocks. But to your point is a good one. You need to drive home a message. And when it comes, if you want to do a radio buy, you don't just do one radio ad. You have to do a lot of radio ads over the course of a couple weeks. When it comes to mail, it's not really a great idea just to do one piece of mail. You need to do 4 or 5 pieces of mail to get people to recognize that.
And as somebody who I believe worked on an Obama campaign, who may be sitting next to me, in the 2008 race, Barack Obama started advertising on radio in May of 2007.
Is that right? Wow, I did not work on that.
And it was the same, right? You worked on a different one. Anyway, but just think of the repetition of the name being out there.
Right.
If for an unknown candidate.
Yeah. Well, let's go through some of the do's and don'ts. I'm going to give you, we're going to do a little rapid fire here with Kay, who has seen it all, right? You've seen it all.
Well,
so
hopefully not.
Maybe not, but I've got a couple rapid fire questions for you. Because when it comes to advocacy, I want your opinion of, is this a good idea or is this a bad idea? And maybe if you could elaborate on why, that would be great. Okay, so that's the game. Are you ready for the game?
Thumbs up, thumbs down.
You're ready. Okay, good. Okay, speed round number 1. Sending 28 form emails to a legislator the week legislative session starts. Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
Given my knowledge of how legislators manage their email, it's largely a bad idea.
A bad idea.
Often, I mean, just consider that, you know, based on how many constituents a legislator may have, that person may not be reading the email that you're sending to an official, website or address. For instance, I doubt that Chuck Grassley reads his individual email because of the simple volume of it.
Right. Now,
But they
will.
will do metrics.
They will do metrics. And in addition to that, if you get an opportunity to send an email, which of course AARP is going to ask you to send emails, and that could be to your city council member, it could be to your legislator, it could be to Chuck Grassley. To the extent that you can make it personalized is really important. So maybe it's a form email and that's fine. But if you can put any nugget in there showing why this issue matters to you, that would be great. I'm gonna.
Well, and just now that you say that, I can remember that Democrats on the House floor have taken to reading email as part of their debate strategy.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
I got this email from X talking about this particular issue, etc.
Well, and one other.
But it's not a form email either. It's about, this is how this issue impacts me.
Right. Well, and that reminds me, and of course now we're down at yet another rabbit hole, but the at the state fair, we had this state fair booth in 2019, and it was at the Varied Industries building, and we had it was a thank you to Chuck Grassley for sponsoring a bill to cut the cost of prescription drugs. And we asked people to share their personal stories. And we asked them to write it down on this card. Now, I purchased, I think, 200 or 300 of these cards, and we ran out of these cards the first day. This is the impact of the high cost of prescription drugs. And so folks were writing there. And when Chuck Grassley came by our booth, and he was literally reading these cards, and this is what to him, he said, number one, I want you to send me these cards. This is really important. And I view these stories as something that I can use as chair of the finance committee to make the point that I'm trying to make, that we need to lower the cost of prescription drugs, which is great. But also the thing that we saw more and more is insulin. We saw so many people talking about the high cost of insulin. And when you see it visually in this booth, it had a really big impact. And to Grassley's credit, he did bring that up in committee. So those personal stories matter. Okay, that's like the least speedy round you can imagine. Okay, we got number 2 in the speed round. Getting your project covered on Radio Iowa. Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, yes, it's a good idea. I have to say that, right? But what I think is interesting is many people in an organization or an individual will think, I need to shoot for the moon. I need to get this story in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Whereas if they're trying to raise money for a skate park in their hometown, who's going to donate to the skate park in their hometown? It's going to be people in the hometown.
Right.
So talking to the local newspaper, the local TV station, in my mind, might be better than getting a story in the New York Times.
There you go. No offense to anyone who is reporting for the New York Times who's on this. By the way, were you surprised when you were announced as the host of Radio Iowa, all the national media coverage that
you mean Iowa Press?
Or Iowa Press, excuse me, when you're the host of Iowa Press,
yes,
I saw all the national reporters were like, oh my God, they made the greatest pick ever, Kay Henderson.
Yeah.
That was
blushing,
good.
blushing.
Okay, good.
Wait, the blushing emoji, we'll just put that up on the
screen. National reporters love Kay Henderson. So, number 3 on the speed round, sending a 5-page press release filled with medical jargon to Iowa reporters. Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, taking the train back, we used to get press releases in the mail and you would open them up and, read them and there'd be a paper copy there. And then there's this thing that was invented called the fax. And it was invented at Iowa State University. Did you know that?
I didn't know
anyway,
the fax was
and
invented
so
at
I
Iowa
believe
State.
so. Anyway, and so we started getting fax, so we would get these paper copies. Now, the majority of the news releases that I get come through email. And I can tell you that currently I have about 20,000 email that I haven't really culled through well, that has come in over the past 4 weeks. So sending me something that's 5 pages long that I can't easily digest is probably not going to be the best way for me to understand what this group or organization or individual is trying to convey to me and my listeners.
So is the point, and I'm curious about this, and I think a lot of our people who are on are curious about this. How do you get a reporter's attention? Is it something short and sweet? Is it like a flashy headline? Is it something substantive, like right in that first paragraph? Is there a trick? How do you get a reporter's attention to make sure that they cover your
I
issue?
think the answer would be yes to all 3 of those
Okay.
things. But one of the most important things I do is just cull. I make decisions about, dozens, if not hundreds of stories we don't have time to cover today. And I'm focused on, just the dozen or so that we are able to commit resources to. And I've made this point to a lot of different organizations. You may have the best pitch ever for me to cover something, but there may be something more important for me to cover. And it's no offense to you. So here's a little anecdote. I remember speaking to a group and I made that point, and someone in the audience said, yes, I can amplify that. I work for the Sioux City Chamber of Commerce, which I think has changed their name since then. We had a news conference and all the TV and radio stations in Sioux City said they were going to be there. And, we're looking at our watch, no one's coming. It's, time to start, no one is here. None of them showed up. So we turned on the radio and found out there'd been a plane crash at the Sioux City airport. United Flight 232 crashed. That was the most important story for those media organizations to be covering that day, which is why they didn't show up at a news conference. So you may have the best news conference planned in Western civilization, and it may not get covered because something more newsworthy happens.
Well, and when it comes to press conferences, as someone who's done communications myself, my dad would always tell me, you miss 100% of the shots that you never take, right? And so shoot for the press conference. If no one shows up, don't take it personally, right? And sometimes, you may be surprised. And so one example of this is Julie Betts, our communications director, put out a press release, and it was talking about clergy scams. And so this was a press release. I think it was earlier this year or maybe late last year. And we do Fraud Watch press releases fairly regularly, but for some reason, this press release on clergy scams caught the attention, and we had more press attention from clergy scams than just about any Fraud Watch release that we've ever sent. So you never know. I guess that's the bottom line. Now, of course, we've tried to replicate that and to no avail, but that's an example of, maybe there was something about that headline, or there was something about the nugget in there that really appealed to the media. Okay, are you right? Okay, number 4.
Has this really been a speed round? I don't
This
know
has
that
been
it
the slowest
has.
speed round on the face of the earth. Number 4, name calling on social media. Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
What do you think, Brad?
I'm asking you. I'm the host here. You're in the hot seat.
Well, as the recipient of folks who sometimes name call, I don't know that politicians respond to that.
I think that's right. And I think, in Iowa, you read about what you're seeing in some of these other states, and I think there is something to Iowa Nice and to getting, your issue to the finish line. And we're just not seeing, at least, for the most part, we're not seeing the name calling that we're seeing across the country. Now, obviously, honestly, the school board election has me a little nervous, the recent school board elections and some of the intensity in those elections. So I'm hoping that is an anomaly and we don't see that. What is your take on the school board elections? Were you kind of surprised to see
No.
How intense they were?
I mean, I've covered a lot of intense things. I mean, I covered Bernie Sanders and his people were intensely supportive of him and intensely antagonistic against some other candidates. And frankly, the media. I mean, everybody thinks it's, people who may have a Republican persuasion that have been, name callers or terribly antagonistic, but it's across the spectrum. And I remember covering the 2004 presidential election. There was a lot of antagonism there. Again, I think it's amplified on social media, and we may see more of it because we're watching videos that somebody took because they have a camera on their phone, which we may not have seen in previous episode cycles.
Right.
I think there's a spin cycle here where something takes hold and gets amplified and more people see it. Then when I was sending stories via phone, I mean, I had to get in line with other reporters to send something via phone, and there were only a limited number of people who could hear my report because they were listening to a radio station. Now they can get on Twitter and see some of these things.
So when you did that first 7-hour, was that over the phone?
No, it was live over the radio.
Live over the radio. Okay. 7 hours. That's just so mind-boggling. Okay, and the final one, we already touched on this a little bit, but good idea or bad idea to use real life examples.
Well, I think you already answered this one.
We did. I did, and that's a good idea, by the way. I don't know if you want to know that, but sometimes it's. I will say this when it comes to real life examples and personal stories, it is so much easier said than done to get personal stories. And one of the things that we're struggling with, frankly, with our elder abuse legislation, and understandably so, is it's hard to get people to share their personal story related to an issue like elder abuse. And so we've had to kind of figure out other ways to get our message across, which is why we're leaning more towards on the paid media side than the earned media side and the personal stories.
Well, and think about how we started this conversation. We talked about women who were the parent of a child with a chronic condition who told their personal stories in public to legislators over and over and over. And I can think about other issues in the legislature. For example, Iowa laws for operating a boat while intoxicated were not the same as operating a car while intoxicated. And I distinctly remember a family whose loved one had died in a drunken boating accident coming to the legislature and telling their story. And that was one of the things that got that particular bill over the finish line in the last century, if you will. But I mean, those kinds of things, sort of spring to mind as you think about certain pieces of legislation that were discussed over and over the years, and then finally crossed the finish line because there was a name and a face with it.
I'm also thinking, as you're talking, I'm also reminded of the tobacco tax and the smoking ban and the American Cancer Society and AARP, frankly, were in favor of those issues for obvious health reasons. But it was one of those issues that you look back and you think, oh my God, there was a time where you could smoke in bars. And if you've gone into a bar that has smoke now, it's like, I can't even believe we used to have this. But it really took a lot of work and a lot of personal stories. And I think I remember Kevin Cooney's brother, Brian Cooney, who was a big part of that because he told his personal story as a bar owner, right?
He owns Cooney's, which is sort of a mainstay of the Beaverdale neighborhood in Des Moines. And he went and told legislators about his own cancer story. So collect those personal stories and get them lined up, but also understand that it's a very difficult thing to do. And our rule of thumb is, look, if you have 3 or 4 really good personal stories, that's a win.
And you need to understand that. And of course, with prescription drugs, it's a totally different thing. I mean, we've got thousands of personal stories, as evident by our fair booth. So now I want to just, we're running a little short on time here, but I do want to ask you, you've just interviewed so many interesting people over the years, and you, because of your unique position as a leader in the Iowa Press Corps and the caucuses and all that comes with that, do you have a favorite person that you have interviewed in the past?
Well, I wouldn't, after interviewing, as you say, probably thousands of people over the years, this week we're remembering former Kansas Senator Bob Dole.
Oh, yeah.
And I have never known anyone to have a quicker wit or a comeback to even the most casual of circumstances. And I've told this story to a couple of people this week. There was an episode where he was coming in to a news conference, and he came in a way different than his staff had told him he'd be coming in. And so my microphone cord was stretched out and he was going to be walking over it. And so I just said, "Senator, there's my mic cord." And he just looked at me and said, "What are you doing? Trying to trip me up?" Like, just like that, just like that.
Yeah. You know, what's funny about Bob Dole is in 1987, when he was first running for president, maybe he wasn't first running, but he was running.
He ran in 79, 82.
Yeah. But anyway, my grandmother took me to a Bob Dole event. And at the time because my grandmother was a giant Bob Dole fan, I was a giant Bob Dole fan. And I just remember being like, "Bob Dole," and like, I was just freaking out to see Bob Dole in person. And he is a guy that, he worked really closely with Tom Harkin on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it was an amazing legislator. So definitely going to be missed, obviously. So now we are running short on time, but I just want to, first of all, thank you for spending the time. And when it comes to local advocacy, just to bring it back to local advocacy and some of the work that the people are doing who are on this call, do you have any tips from your seat? And so your seat is obviously one that is media related. And again, it's more, if you've got a bike lane or if you've got a sidewalk that you're trying to connect or something, think of like Windsor Heights. Remember how controversial that issue is. What would be your advice on getting that project into the bloodstream of the local neighborhood or the community?
Well, I think you're probably the better expert on that, but I would just end by saying that if you're going to interact with someone from a media organization, find out what their deadlines are.
That's such practical advice. Yes.
Right. So, for instance, if you're going to the local newspaper, like the Lennox Timetable, it's a weekly. So if you go in on, let's say, Wednesday, the day the paper comes out, your article isn't going to be in that newspaper on Wednesday, the day it comes out. If you go in on Tuesday, the day before, it probably isn't, because they have the paper all laid out and they've got a plan and it's all ready to the printer. So you have to understand when a particular deadline is, or what is occupying the reporter that you're trying to reach. I think those are really important things to consider. For instance, if you call a radio reporter, early in the morning, they're probably live on the air telling you things. If you hear them on the radio, it's probably not a good thing to call.
Practical advice. So meet your reporter deadlines and don't call a radio personality while he or she is on air. Unless it's a call-in program, and unless you plan on being really good on radio. Well, thank you, Kay. Always a pleasure. And we're going to now move to a 10-minute break. And then right after the break, we're going to talk a little bit about AARP goals for 2022. And then we're going to walk through, and we've done some of this, but we're going to walk through some of the nuts and bolts of advocacy, have you help get your project to the finish line. So right now we'll go to a 10-minute break and we'll see you after the break. Thank you.